Hello and welcome to Inside Exercise. I'm Emeritus Professor Glenn McConell. Today I'm bringing to you Professor José González-Alonso from Brunel University in London. He's done a massive amount of work on exercise in the heat, dehydration, fluid ingestion, and human circulation during exercise. He has a really interesting background, and I've actually known him and his work for over 30 years when I was doing exercise on the effect of fluid ingestion on heart rate and body temperature, etc. So we had a great chat about that. So he started off, he's from Spain, and then he did his master's and PhD with Eddie Coyle in Texas, who I've already had on the podcast, big name in exercise, metabolism, etc. And then he moved to Copenhagen, where he researched with real royalty over there. So Bengt Saltine, a massive name in exercise physiology and metabolism for 50 years or so, who has unfortunately passed away now. And also with Bodil Nielsen, who a great researcher in her own right, and the youngest child of August and Marie Krogh. So August Krogh won the Nobel Prize for his work on circulation and muscle, and him and Marie brought insulin to Denmark. So very interesting background. I think you'll really enjoy this one, so stick around. Hi, Jose. Welcome to Inside Exercise. How are you?
I'm fine, Glenn. Thank you for having me.
No, I'm excited to chat. So I don't actually know if we actually met at a conference or not, but we kind of go back a long way in terms of we're both looking at fluid ingestion and carbohydrate ingestion and things way back in the 90s. And you've continued on with that, and I sort of moved off and looked at other things. So it's fun to have, a chat about all this stuff.
Yeah, it's definitely. I started my master and PhD in Eddie Coyle's laboratory at the University of Texas in Austin. I remember that there were similarity between the work that you were doing in Australia and also Hargrave, Mark Hargrave,
yes,
Mark Hargrave. All of those groups that were working in similar areas.
Yes. So why don't you tell us, it's quite nice sometimes to chat about how did you actually end up? Were you like a sports person who took an interest in exercise, or did you do exercise and then Eddie said, let's look at exercise, or what happened?
I'm originally from Spain, from the Canary Islands, close to Africa. Island called Tenerife, but I did my undergraduate degree in physical education in Barcelona.
Okay.
And the main reason is because that allows me to train there. I was an endurance runner there. I was training with a good group. I was very interested in the different theories of how to improve human performance. Many of your guests that you have, and I was very interested in the theory of training. And then by the end of the 5-year degree, I was invited to evaluate some data from, it was called Eurofit. There was a battery of tests to test the fitness of children. So I put together a poster. I have to analyze some data. So it got me interested in.
Sorry, was that part of your undergraduate? You had a 5-year undergraduate degree, was it?
Yeah, but it was in Spain at that time. We have a degree that it was. It's called licenciado. There was it included like a master, but so that's how it was organized at that time. We are talking about from 1982 to 1987. So, yes. But from there, then I was interested, and I was also training with other people. And one of my friends have gone to Austin, Texas, because he was interested in doing a master there. But then he decided not to go. But then he gave me all the information, and then I followed his step. I went to study English there for a year and do all the examinations, and then eventually I started a master there. It fitted nicely because I was interested in running. I was running, and then in that program, I was a outstanding program at that time. Like Jack Whitmore was there, Eddie Coyle, John Ivey, a number of other excellent teachers and researchers. So it was a right environment for me. So that's where I really started. And then in the master, thesis, so Professor Eddie Coyle, Dr. Coyle, we call him, at that time, he mentored me and actually then got the opportunity to pursue a PhD. My master was more in rehydration after exercise, but there was a component of exercise in mechanical dehydration, and that linked nicely to them experiments on prolonged exercise and dehydration and the effects of environmental conditions. And
yeah, I mean, you had some great advisors there. Yeah, so Eddie Coyle's already been on the podcast, as we chatted about before you came on. He's a great guy. And you know, Jack Wilmore and John Ivy's there as well. So in Austin, Texas, University of Texas. And then you moved on to Copenhagen. So how did that come about? How did you actually?
Well, it was more during the master and the PhD. We were studying all different papers, invasive paper from the Scandinavian groups, and then when we characterized the cardiovascular responses and identifying the cardio output and decrease, confirming previous data of Michael Saka, he did experiments during prolonged exercise. And at the same time, your group were doing experiments in that line as well. Then the next step, because at that point there was a controversy, like Professor Lauren Rall had put forward a hypothesis that when you superimpose heat stress, heavy exercise, you should have a reduction in muscle blood flow because there's a competition between the skin. This concept, this hypothesis that a competition between muscle and the skin the skin will win. At that time, Bodil Nielsen, together with Ben's team, have done different experiments with the knee extensor, just heating. I was a postdoc at that time from Canada, Savar, and she published a number of papers where they were not able to actually find that blood flow was reduced. So I thought that maybe with the intervention of dehydration, where we found that cardio output could be reduced by 4 liters per minute, or 20% compared to the control euhydration condition, that would be a paradigm that was interested to characterize that. And in Copenhagen, they have the thermal dilution technique that allows you to measure muscle blood flow. It's an invasive technique, but it's the one that works to be able to measure blood flow during exercise and at the same time take blood samples to characterize arteriovenous difference for a number.
All right. So there's more royalty there. So Bank Saltine, unfortunately, the late Bank Saltine, massive name. So if people don't know, because this is part of the problem, you find students don't always know these names, once people pass away. So you need to know some big names. So Bank Saltine, Phil Golnick, all sorts of. You said Lauren Rowell. Rowell. Okay, so why don't we just step back a little bit? So there's a fair bit there. You talk about controversies with muscle blood flow and things. Why don't we just make sure everyone's on the same page here? So if you start exercise, and let's just assume it's mild. So if we go through sort of trying to keep a bit of structure. So if you do prolonged exercise in mild conditions and you're not drinking fluids, for example, what happens to your heart rate, your stroke volume, your cardiac output, your muscle blood flow, etc. And then we might move into, okay, so what if it's hot? And then what if you drink fluids? And what if you have fluids and carbohydrate and all that sort of stuff? Yeah. So can we just start off? Because I know you guys have done amazing work way back there with Eddie Coyle, and then you've obviously done a lot more on just, what's happening during prolonged exercise in mild temperatures.
Yeah, it is yes, ambient temperature have an important impact on the effects of dehydration. From on one hand, actually during mild environmental conditions, one doesn't sweat as much. But if the intensity mimics what happens in outdoor conditions, where you run a marathon in 12, 13 degrees centigrade, where actually the athletes perform at their best, they still become somewhat dehydrated, and all depends on the duration. If the duration is 3 hours, you can still become dehydrated by 3 to 4%. In those environments, you still have, and that's I relate to experiments in well-controlled conditions, like a paper in 1991 by Hamilton in Eddie Cole's laboratory that characterized those responses. Even in a thermonuclear environment, you still have rate increases and there's a reduction in cardio output. But that extent of this cardiovascular strain is smaller than if the same person is exercising in a hot environment. The responses are magnified. So if you go then to even a cold environment, that's something that also we did as part of my PhD thesis, is you're dehydrated by 4% and you exercise in a very cold environment, like 0 degrees or 5 degrees. You still have some increase in heart rate, but the reduction in cardio output is completely prevented, and even the rise of core temperature can be prevented in a very cold environment. So the cooler environments ameliorate the effects of dehydration. Can be in a very cool, or almost the effects are minimal.
Yes. Okay. So if you're exercising, you're saying naturally, if it's cool, you're not going to have to sweat as much. So then you won't lose as much fluid. Do you want to just talk about where's that fluid actually coming from? You've got the plasma volume, you've got the overall blood volume, you've got the fluid, elsewhere. Why don't you just talk about, I want to get this sort of concept that you're exercising, your heart rate goes up and then it sort of plateaus out and then it's going to sort of drift up. So cardiovascular drift, depending on what happens to your sweat rates, your sodium levels, all that sort of stuff. Can we just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, when one is losing like 3 kilograms or 3 liters of fluid from the body, that fluid is coming from the intravascular space, so mainly plasma volume, the interstitial space, and intracellular space. The intracellular space is the bigger, so in absolute term contributes more to those 3 liters. Let's say it is 1.5 or so. It comes from the intracellular, particularly the skin and skeletal muscle. They tend to contribute more to that loss in body. And if you think about the streams, a condition where somebody dehydrates, you can see that the skin can wrinkle because it's highly dehydrated. Okay. So, but in regards to the impact of these fluid losses in cardiovascular function, by using plasma volume restoration, plasma volume expansion, we have exercise in a cold environment, we have been able to identify what is the effect of intracellular, interstitial versus vascular. As I mentioned before, in a cold environment, you can still be dehydrated by 4%. So you still have 3 kilos or 3 liters less body water, but the effects are very minimal. And if you restore blood volume, you completely restore cardiovascular function to control levels, despite you still have 3 liters less of total body water.
Okay, so that's when you're infusing. Is that when you're infusing dextran or something? You're infusing something to keep the water in the blood.
Yes. So if you normally lose about 300 milliliters of plasma from your 5 liters of blood that the average person has, then you lose, and part of that, 55% or so, it is plasma. So let's say that you have 3 liters of plasma, you lose about 300 milliliters of that. If you replace that with a plasma volume expansion in a heat, and this is what Scott Montaigne and Eddie Cole did, in the heat, you ameliorate, at least you ameliorate the effects on stroke volume. Half of that decrease in stroke volume is reduced, and is to some extent that cardio output is restored to normal level.
Yeah, so just to summarize, so when you're exercising prolonged, you're sweating, you're losing your plasma volume, therefore you're losing some blood volume. To maintain your cardiac output, you've got to have, your stroke volume drops a little bit, so you've got to have a higher heart rate to maintain your cardiac output. And you're saying that it's been shown if you prevent that loss in blood volume, you will totally prevent that cardiovascular drift, you won't have to have a higher heart rate to maintain the cardiac output.
Yeah.
Is that right? Yeah.
Yes, but there's a caveat to that, and I used to think in that way. The evidence have changed my mind in regards to the role of heart rate. It is the heart rate pacing experiments. When you pace the heart, you increase heart rate, you still have the same cardio output. And that links nicely what is the effect of the heart versus the periphery in the control of circulation. So, yes, normally with the cardiovascular drift, you have an increase in heart rate, and we say that that's compensate, but that's only happens, that compensation happens is you have a proportional change in venous return coming back. Independently, an increase in heart rate doesn't change cardio output. And
because you just have a lower stroke volume.
Yeah, it's in proportion. Even during maximal exercise or rest, this is show how integrative physiology, how important it is, because you gain an insight that isolated responses that we characterize sometimes when we remove cells. So then when you put them in vivo, when you have all the factors, they might not work in the same way. And the heart rate, it is one of the responses that the pacing experiment have clarified about the impact and how they are interact with what happening in the periphery. And clarify that phenomenon.
So maybe my understanding is a bit old-fashioned or something. So during exercise, when your heart rate drifts, so the cardiovascular drift, what do we know about the reason for that? Because I just thought it was, like I said, reduction in plasma volume and therefore less venous returns or less stroke volume, so therefore you have to increase your heart rate. Maybe that's a part of it, but also isn't it like this, the increase in sodium, if you're not drinking enough, can affect that? And I don't know, the higher adrenaline is going to put your heart rate up. Now, what is your understanding? Why do you get cardiovascular drift? I guess I'm saying, what's the latest thinking on that?
I think in many, the approach that we have taken to investigate that paradigm, it is to always have a control condition where responses are maintained. So the effect of exercise is controlled for. And so from that control condition where heart rate is maintained, when stroke volume is maintained, then we superimpose dehydration. And in that conditions where cardio output decreases. Initially, we were just focusing on cardio output. That's what we could measure. We have this rebreathing technique we could measure. More recently, we have used like ultrasound, and you are able to look at the filling and emptying of the heart, also contractility of the heart. And you actually, with dehydration during prolonged exercise, if anything, the contractility of the heart, so how the heart is working, if anything is working better, it increases. So what with a number of measurements that we have made, actually have changed our mind that in the way we see that we believe now that actually the venous return plays a major role. And yes, the dehydration, why stroke volume is reduced, is because the filling of the heart and the diastolic volume is reduced compared to the control conditions. But end-systolic or how much blood remains in the heart is actually smaller. So that thing says that the heart itself is working harder. So it's not because the heart itself is failing. It is a periphery, changes in periphery, particularly blood flow. Actually, blood flow in the periphery, we have some in the forearm, in the brain, blood flow to the brain reduces, blood flow to the muscle reduces. So that level of reduction in flow impact venous flow and impact the filling of the heart.
Okay.
That's where we are at the moment.
And you mentioned like 3%, 4%. I'm interested in David Kostel, who I did my master's with way back, and another one. If people haven't looked him up, they need to look him up. He used to always say 2% reduction. If you had 2% reduction in your body weight, that would then reduce your performance. Is that, you weren't talking about body weight earlier, so I'm probably, when you said 3, oh, you were, okay. Is that still the thinking, do you know, or is that, does it depend on the event? Or,
it is, there have been, I mean, in this area, there have been many other groups that have contributed much more than we have in regards to the effect of performance at this low level of 1 to 2%. And the idea is that at that range of 1 to 1.5%, it is very difficult to actually demonstrate that there's a clear substantial effect on performance. It's when you go above 2%, when there's a more consistent impairment. It makes sense because there's some variability of just repeating a performance bout. So you always have to have an effect that's beyond that.
And the other one, I guess, is if you're talking about how much dehydration do you have to have affect performance, and keeping in mind you said you haven't done that much with that. What about the events that if you're doing a running race that takes, I don't know, 30 minutes, 40 minutes, something like that, do you think you need to drink fluid during the event, or?
No, it is like, it's very interesting. Still in the World Championship, you see that during the 5,000 meters and these elite athletes that can run, many of them below 13 minutes. And if you calculate the sweat rate over 13 minutes, it is small. And then they still have tables with water so they can go and rehydrate during that time. I think it's counterproductive in that short period of time. And even in the 10,000 meters at that speed that you go, it is very difficult to drink. And if you again, even in 27 or 28 minutes that you run, well, more than closer to 27 in the World Championship for the 10,000, it is that you don't lose that substantial amount of fluid. So many of them they drink before, and you see them with the bottles before, and that I think is fine. And then you drink after.
Yeah, I remember I used to do there's a race in Sydney, the City to Surf. It's a 14-kilometer race. So I guess that's about 8 miles or 8.5 miles, I think it is. And they used to always had, every kilometer or something, there'd be these drinks, but which some people take, half the day to finish it, and it's often hot. But I remember the woman who won that, Lisa Martin, who became Lisa Ondieki, she actually got the silver medal in the Olympics and gold in the Commonwealth Games marathon. I remember she ran the whole thing, and she ran 45:50, I think, and she didn't drink it all. And I was like, what? And then I realized, I guess part of it's just having it in your mouth, maybe. I think, it's, but you would probably say, and she obviously did fine, you don't need to, right? Over something that takes, I don't know, 45 minutes, an hour, maybe an hour is getting about borderline. Or,
yeah. It is any event below an hour, it's more difficult to show an impact. It's different if you start hypohydrated. That's a different thing. But if you are fully hydrated, that's like all elite athletes do, and they have a breakfast or so. And they have optimized their pre-performance hydration, energy status. So they in those conditions, and they even drink something right before, they should be fine.
That's a nice little segue there when you said below an hour, because the paper by Below that you were on, Below yourself, Eddie Coyle, looked at an hour of exercise. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that one? So he had the 4 conditions. That was quite interesting. Yeah.
It is, that was a high intensity, 80%. And that mimics the conditions, for example, the time trial in cycling that is about an hour. And in that study, actually, the combination of carbohydrate and fluid improved performance. The times that they are not as there's significant effect, and there's a percentage clear improvement in performance. But compared to other conditions where we do, there's minutes of different, that was a smaller. But that's in that particular experiment, 80% VO2 max, high intensity exercise for an hour, we are able to identify effects. So we were, before we were talking about 45 minutes. So the concept that a shorter event, I think, is holds, but then whether just, then one has to be specific about whether that 1 hour in this particular study, there was an effect.
Yeah, I have to say 1 hour
to be consider that those evidence.
Definitely 1 hour is very much the cutting point, because I did a study with an hour and there's no effect, but you guys got a nice effect there. But that was nice that you had no fluid or carbohydrate, and then you had fluid only, sorry, water only.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it was probably artificially sweetened, but you had fluid with no carbohydrate. Then you had carbohydrate, but just very small amount, so not much fluid.
Mm-hmm.
And then you had both. And yeah, that was a nice. So why don't you just tell us, so what happens then, therefore, if you are doing prolonged exercise and you want to prevent your dehydration and you ingest fluid, why don't you tell us, what effects that's having on cardiovascular drift, etc. Yeah.
Yes, it is. Actually, there's some insight that we have gained also from the experiments. In all the experiment we have done, we always try to match the carbohydrate intake by adjusting the fluids that people drink. So during the full fluid replacement, you get the same carbohydrate compared to also the condition of dehydration, where you ingest in a highly concentrated solution that amount of carbohydrate. But what is important, that amount of carbohydrate alone doesn't prevent the effects of dehydration. So it's not the carbohydrate itself. So it is the fluid plays a major role.
Yes. So if you just tell us how is that fluid actually improving your cardiovascular function and your performance, I guess. So what's it actually doing?
In these athletes that are familiarized with drinking large volumes of fluid, you need to drink about 1.8 to almost 2 liters of fluid per hour to be able to maintain hydration. We have noticed that in these people, they don't urinate. They don't need to urinate urine with these carbohydrate electrolyte solutions. So they're able to absorb very quickly. And we also measure it in body weight. We measure in blood, hematocrit, hemoglobin. And so you can measure plasma volume and blood volume. They're able to maintain the plasma volume better compared to the dehydration condition. So there's a vascular effect there. They have an impact. And there's different studies where you just remove plasma and they have a circulatory effect. So there's a clear mechanistic effect of that why drinking have an effect. So the vascular is affected, but you are rehydrating also the cells, the muscle, the skin. And so that's also linked to different metabolic sympathoglycinergic activity that is affected. So there's interaction of factors, but definitely drinking during prolonged exercise in the heat, that's actually a very important point. You train people that are partially heat acclimatized, are able to maintain this dynamic homeostasis.
Yeah.
So there was this concept that people, they say, oh, you exercise in a hot environment and this is really bad. No, but this very trained people in those experimental conditions are able to maintain homeostasis, the same as they will do in a cold environment.
Yes, so that's not, so you've shown that, and we did it as well, but we didn't have this nice measurements. We didn't have the cardiac output and things, but basically it seemed like if you drink fluid or you don't drink fluid, the first hour or so, the heart rate goes up the same. And then after the first hour, so again, it's this sort of hour cutoff, then it makes a difference. If you're not drinking fluid, your heart rate continues to drift up. If you are drinking fluid equal to your fluid losses, which as you say is quite a lot, you're able to, as you said, maintain your homeostasis. You basically, your heart rate doesn't drift anymore. Your cardiac output stays constant. So it's quite incredible, yeah?
Yeah. It is, I mean, there's a classic figure from Costill also showing that with core temperature, with dehydration that separates over time, and particularly they become more evident after 1 hour of exercise. There's a continuous. You know the difference between the statistical significance and the physiological trends. There's a continuous there.
Guess what? Somehow we've managed to go half an hour or something. I haven't talked about body temperature. I knew there was something I wasn't. So that's the thing as well, that when you say your homeostasis, so after the first hour, if you're drinking equal to your fluid losses, your body temperature, sort of goes up in the first hour, whether you drink or not, pretty much. And then it stays constant as well. So as you say, you're able to maintain your homeostasis in terms of cardiac function and body temperature. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it is. There's a beautiful study, just isolated heart, Patterson and Stanley in 1912, where they have isolated heart and they just change the temperature of the blood. And you can see in their preparation, heart rate increases with increases in temperature of the blood. Cardio output is maintained under those conditions, but in heart rate. So there can be an effect of just temperature itself.
And as you said, you mentioned the sympathetic nervous system. So the other thing is, people know about adrenaline, of course. So adrenaline goes up more during exercise when you're not drinking fluid. It goes up more when it's hot, and that will then stimulate muscle glycogen breakdown and things. So if you can drink fluid and keep your homeostasis, you keep your adrenaline down, you actually spare muscle glycogen. There's a couple of papers that I think some found it did, some found it didn't. But definitely, do you know the latest on that?
Yeah. It is the first paper with the effects of dehydration and glycogen utilization was Mark Hargrave in 1996, and Journal of Applied Physiology, who was his group were the first to characterize that glycogen utilization was greater and when dehydrated and core temperature was elevated and muscle temperature was elevated compared to the rehydrated condition. We have shown some that Lawrence Spritz's laboratory has some the same with dehydration, even they have bioxys in 1 hour and then at the end of exercise. So it seems that there's some consistency there. In that condition, you have the higher temperature, you have the higher adrenaline, you have the higher glucagon, you have other number of factors, the cortisol. So the number of factors that can affect metabolism. And Mark Hargrave have, with Mark February, PhD thesis, they tried to elucidate what was the effect of adrenaline, what is the effect of temperature, and that was very, very nice work.
So as you said, Mark February, because when you've got the higher adrenaline and the higher temperature, you've got to say, well, is it both, or is it? So I remember Mark February did the thing. I remember seeing that he had the cuff around one quad where he made it cold water, and then he had a cuff around the other quad where he made it hot water, and I think he showed higher muscle glycogen during the same exercise use with the hot leg. So it was fun days, all that stuff. Okay, so I was thinking about some of these Twitter questions here that we've got that came through. So thanks people for sending those through. I know you're not a Twitter. There's definitely pros and cons of being on Twitter, so I wouldn't necessarily encourage you to go on, but I sent these through earlier. So Alan McCubbin would love to hear his thoughts on, one, the independent roles of total body water, plasma volume, and osmolality on heart rate, body temperature, and performance. So maybe we've talked about the water, we've talked about plasma volume. Maybe just explain a little bit what we're talking about there of osmolality, just to bring people up to speed who maybe don't know what that is.
Osmolality is the index of how many particles one has in the blood, and that becomes higher when plasma fluid or plasma volume is reduced. So osmolality is increased with dehydration. And there's osmoreceptors, particularly in the brain, and in the hypothalamus that are linked to control of temperature. We have discussed a little bit about the effects of before of what happened dehydration in a very cold environment, and that you are able to, during some maximal exercise, to completely reverse the effects of dehydration by having restored blood volume and you still are dehydrated. But one point that I can make, it comes from maximal exercise, where there was the thesis of Lars Niveau in Copenhagen that I supervised, together with Bodil Nielsen, that also in the dehydration condition, when during maximal exercise, VO2 max, it was significantly, markedly depressed compared to the control condition. So even the condition where we prevented an increase in core temperature, we put circulated cold water through a suit, and so kept the skin cold. The core temperature was the same as the control. So under this condition, the some level of performance was restored, but still VO2 max was reduced compared to the control condition. And that is associated with the lower blood volume, plasma volume. So there's condition if you are exercising, the Winter Olympics in cross-country skiing, being dehydrated under those conditions is not very good if you have to go very high intensity either. So you have to be as hydrated as possible, because VO2 max, so maximum aerobic capacity can be impaired under those conditions. Despite during some maximal exercise, it's very difficult to see an impact on metabolism.
Okay, so just to make sure people are clear, so it's generally accepted that VO2 max is determined by your maximum cardiac output. So you're saying there that if you've got a reduced plasma volume, you have a reduced blood volume, and therefore, is that what you're saying? You have a less of a maximum stroke volume and maximum cardiac output, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
The thing that have become evident over time, probably it is in every generation of scientists, is always like that. You bring in new elements. More recently, there have been experiments in looking at blood flow regulation when you change oxygenation of the blood. And you can see that if you are anemic, then you still can maintain during some maximal conditions oxygen delivery by increasing flow in proportion to the reduction in content, and the opposite with polycythemia, with carbon monoxide. So what I'm trying to say it is that before we have a very cardiocentric view of the circulatory responses, and now we are trying to understand that actually what's happening in the periphery is more determining what the heart is doing, more the other way around. And that becomes more clear when you measure blood flow in different territories in the body during exercise. If cardio output were the determinant of flow, you will think that when cardio output increases, like during incremental exercise, it goes from 5 liters per minute at rest to 25 in trained people, or 30 in highly elite athletes or more. But blood flow to the brain increases and then decreases. For example, blood flow to the guts, and it also decreases. So that's cannot be then. If cardio output just solely determine the peripheral flow, then you should have an increase in flow in those territories as well. So also when you do exercise with one leg only, blood flow increases in that leg, but it doesn't increase in the other leg unless you start moving it. So that tells you that when you exercise with one leg and your blood flow to the leg goes up to 5-6 liters, cardio output increases in proportion. So you have now 12 liters cardio output, but blood flow in my arm doesn't necessarily increases. So that's the other way of looking at the mechanism by which this adjustments that occurs during exercise and this cardiovascular strain occurs and underlying mechanisms.
Okay, so you get local dilators, yeah. So you're getting the in the contracting muscle, yes. That you don't have any other areas. I guess you slightly lost me there. Sorry, well, I lost myself. What was your point?
It is with the link. with the dehydration paradigm where blood flow to the skeletal muscle reduces, but you are measuring blood flow in an inactive, you're doing semi-recumbent cycling.
Yes.
In active forearm, blood flow goes down.
Yes.
If you look at blood flow at the brain, blood flow to the brain also decreases. So when you're having this decrease in cardio output, there's also decreases in flow in the periphery. It kind of makes sense. But what come first? Is the reducing cardio output or the reducing in peripheral flow? And the point I'm trying to make is that nowadays we try to see more that the importance of what happened in the periphery determining more what cardio output than the other way around. Basically, cardio output accommodates the changes in the peripheral flow.
Yes, so that especially
rather than determine the flow in itself, unless in normal, healthy people.
So it's kind of like what you were saying earlier, that the main determinant of cardiac output and stroke volume is your venous return. So how much blood is coming back from the periphery? Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Yep. Yes. And this is an idea. I mean, Guyton already with his experiments in the dog, he already indicated that and said that when you pace the heart in these preparations, they don't change cardio output. So it is, and that is a beautiful intervention because you are just affecting the rate of depolarization in the heart. So it is the heart rate. Let's say you're only changing heart rate. It's not like pharmacological interventions. You are affecting many different other issues.
Okay. Right, another one from Twitter, and it's something we haven't overly talked about, is the humidity. So Maya, M-A-I-A, it shouldn't be that hard. What's the main factor, if there is a main one, for exercise performance impairment in hot and humid conditions? So just talking about, you know, the effect that having dry air versus humid air has. Obviously, when it's hot, it's going to be more important.
It's the environmental conditions, as we said initially, plays a major role because it modifies the external stimuli that affects the level of stress on the body. And so by tweaking humidity, tweaking the temperature, the ambient temperature, you affect the rate of hypothermia. What is very important is to think that if you are doing walking in a hot environment, you don't necessarily immediately impact core temperature. At low intensities and at rest, in a hot environment, you can still have the same core temperature. And this Bodil Nielsen in 1938 already demonstrated that there's core temperature independent of the environment from 35 degrees to 35 when you are doing low intensity exercise. And then there are a lot of work later on, and Mike Saka have reviewed that nicely a number of times, that thermoneutral zone, it becomes smaller with the intensity of exercise going up. But what I'm trying to say here is, yes, that I think for the understanding of the responses of the athletes to performance, it's better to think about hypothermia or dehydration. It's the internal physiological strain, and that can be induced by different environmental conditions. We know for sure that your level of core temperature is very high, and it's very reproducible. You get to around 40 and a half, it's impossible for people to continue exercise. They basically fatigue. So yes, there's an upper limit of temperatures that one can reach, and that can be induced by different environment and different level of dehydration. So this have to be considered in establishing the impact. One last point that maybe I'm extending more than to try to simplify or address that more directly that question. I don't believe that there's a single factor that is responsible for fatigue. It all depends on the paradigm one uses. We use the Fick principle. We use the Ohm's law to understand, and those are equations. There are 3 component equations. And within each of the components, there's many different factors that affect. So just saying that it is hypothermia, yes, it's very reproducible that when you get to this high temperature, you stop. By saying it is just temperature in one side of the body, it's too simplistic. You have to think about the multiple effects that are occurring. When you have the high temperature, you have also reduced cardio output, you have peripheral for reduced, there's some alteration in substrate utilization, ventilation is higher. So how you cannot really identify that there's only a single factor.
Okay, so just I'll get back to that in a moment, the actual fatigue. But maybe just I wanted to get out that concept of the humidity part. So, you know, people, we always have the Australian Open here in the middle of summer. And people say, oh, that person's sweating so much today. They weren't sweating as much yesterday. And you say, well, yes, today is much more humid. So, you know, it's harder to evaporate. I just want to get that point out. You know, if it's humid, you can't evaporate as much. So you'll have the water dripping off you more. I wanted to get that out. But the thing you said about, so what's causing the performance, why are they fatiguing or not performing as well in the heat? Do you want to just talk a bit about that? Because we had Samuel Marcora on last week, and we're saying, what determines fatigue? Is it sort of, is it central, the central hypothesis, et cetera, or not? And I know before we started, we chatted a little bit about that. Did you want to just say a little bit about that?
This is definitely an area of interest, and in the last 20 years, I think that there have been a lot of new data into measuring blood flow and metabolism across the brain to see whether actually metabolism of the brain it is impaired, and we are center drive. I remember being part of an experiment with Bodil Nielsen's lab where we measure EEG activity also to try to elucidate whether center drive is reduced. I have become more aware of the data that there's quite a lot in the literature measuring EMG activity, that is the muscle electrical activity during fatiguing exercise, including hypothermia and hypoxia. And what is interesting during contact exercise, before fatigue, you have this exponential increase in EMG activity, knowing that the brain is responsible for firing for activating skeletal muscle. Then the only way that one can interpret that is that central drive, if anything, it is increasing. So it might be that the brain participates in this fatigue phenomenon, but not necessarily by reducing the central drive. We ourselves have put together some ideas from the literature and the data that we have, and we have kind of gone back to the classical concept of Hill, where about limitations in skeletal muscle metabolism, and actually I kind of support the data that we have support that idea. An unknown area in physiology, of exercise physiology, is how much muscle is actually active. But based on the EMG activity, if anything, muscle activity, the muscle mass engaged to maintain the same power is going up. We measure oxygen consumption that is stable or goes down. Then you know that anaerobic energy provision have low capacity, kind of overcome or compensate for this reduction in oxidative phosphorylation in the pathways that generate energy aerobically, cannot compensate very long. So when you consider the muscle mass is going up and you calculate energy or ATP per unit of muscle, you probably, it makes to me that that is going down. When you're fatiguing, there's a reduction in total energy turnover. per unit of muscle engaged. So that could be one major factor. And that is because in the brain and in the heart, is anything is going the other way. Oxygen consumption is going up in those territories. It makes sense because they are vital organs. Even during when we are doing maximal exercise, we are working to closer to the capacity of the muscle, but not the capacity of the heart or the capacity of the brain.
Okay, so with so exercise in the heat, and when you're getting near fatigue, you're saying you have an increase in EMG, if anything, which is the more messages being sent from the brain to the muscle. Mm-hmm. But what are you saying is happening? If anything, you're producing less ATP per unit muscle. Is that what you said?
Yeah, it is. If that can indicate, if you say that you have 7 kilos of muscle in a leg active, when EMG activity goes up, might indicate that rather than 7, there might be 7.5.
Yes.
Kilos. Mm-hmm. But oxygen consumption, what we can measure in the leg, if anything, goes down. So when you say ATP, total ATP per unit of muscle, per kilo of muscle active, if anything, could be going down. Rather
and what do you
up.
think's going on there? So what do you think's happening? It's not, I know some people are going to be thinking, oh, it's because you're using more anaerobic metabolism, but that's not the case because your lactate doesn't really go up towards fatigue.
Yeah, well, yeah, it does. It does. In
the heat near fatigue.
Yeah. You measure muscle lactate. In the experiments we have done, we measure also intracellular metabolites at the time of fatigue, and then we have a control condition at the same isotype, and you can see differences in muscle lactate, creatine utilization, and ATP.
That's interesting, because when you mentioned Mark Hargraves, he was my PhD supervisor. When we do exercise to exhaustion in mild conditions, fatigue, go as long as you can. If we do a biopsy, we don't really see much changing at the point of fatigue. So we sort of think, oh, it's not that something muscle metabolic has happened. But you're saying if it's in the heat, yeah, you see stuff happens at the point of fatigue versus like 10 minutes before or something. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, it is easier to see the differences during maximal exercise, high intensity exercise compared to submaximal exercise. And also it's easier to see with dehydration and hypothermia during submaximal exercise compared to control conditions.
Hey, one thing we discussed before we came on air was you were saying we should talk about what we get in the lab with the participants we use, or you use, versus like elite athletes. You were saying we should probably talk about that a little bit. What did you have in mind there?
Yeah, it is. We should acknowledge that the participants that we normally test, even test people that are highly trained, but not necessarily the elite ones, and the effects that, for example, heat acclimatization, or also the effects of dehydration in those elite athletes might be smaller than we characterize in very good athletes. So this is something that should be definitely investigated in the future. So to be more specific about the recommendation we make to elite athletes.
I guess the other thing I was just thinking was, and you touched on earlier with David Costel's stuff, and you were saying you were drinking they were drinking 1.8 liters an hour. The other thing might be to consider running versus cycling, because a lot of the stuff you did and we did was cycling, and it's a bit easier to maybe drink.
Yeah, it is. I mean, from this point, Eddie Cole made that point 20 years ago in a review that you have to think about the trade-off physiologically, drinking a lot, maintaining your physiology, but in outside conditions, the trade-off, you slow down. The environmental conditions might be slightly different. So his recommendation, and I support that, it is in practical conditions, you don't have to drink to rehydrate fully, but just partially hydrate. That could be the recommendation.
And it's harder obviously when you're running to drink than cycling.
Yeah, definitely it is. With cycling, it's very easy. With running, I have run 2 marathons myself, and it's extremely difficult. No matter how, you know, the runner is not the scientist there in the field. No matter how clear in your mind it is about the benefit, it's really difficult. And it's interesting that the technology to provide fluids have not changed. We still have the cup, the plastic cup, so or the bottles are very difficult to use, and particularly during running, we should actually find some ways to deliver the fluids.
I guess we should just point out as well that people have to, you know, don't turn up and do a marathon and decide to drink how much we were talking about. You need to do it in training, and as you said, maybe you won't be able to get in as much as the science is suggesting. But definitely practicing. You see Eliud Kipchoge, you know, he seems to drink every 5K. He gets a little bit in there, but I'm sure he's not drinking equal to his fluid losses. He would not be doing that.
No, but probably that's what we were saying. The effects are very clear when you don't drink versus you drink a lot. But in the field, and when they run normally, well, second Olympic marathon, like in Tokyo, he won, and he still ran very fast. And those conditions is very difficult to drink full fluid replacement. But one could guess that you also lose time if you try to drink so much. And as you mentioned before, during running, there's gastrointestinal problems as well that can that can have a negative impact on your performance rather than the beneficial one.
Now, one of the things you mentioned, we talked about dehydration a lot, and you touched on hypohydration. Do you want to just explain what that is? And, you know, you can maybe tie into that, like if someone was doing a race tomorrow or something, what would you suggest they do to reduce the chance of starting hypohydrated?
Yeah, well, those recommendations are up there, and I think generally people have done a good job in indicating that one have to start euhydrated, so the normal body weight at the start of the race. So one have to eat well, be carbohydrate loaded before with fluid, so you have your normal body weight to start with, and you ensure that by drinking a little bit more than normal, but not too much, because otherwise it's counterproductive. You have to urinate during the race. It is,
oh my gosh. Yeah, I think I mentioned this in another podcast, but I had a friend that I went through undergrad with in exercise science, and he did an Ironman race, and he said he had to urinate 8 times during the bike. And he said, what do you think happened there? And I said, you drank too much. You know, it's not rocket science, you know. So that's the other thing. Obviously, people can't just be looking at it and going, okay, I need to drink 250 mils every 15 minutes. And then without thinking, how much am I actually going to be sweating? How fast am I going to be going? Like if you're going really slow, so, you know, I talked about the City to Surf. If you walk it and you take 3 hours and you're drinking 250 mils every 15 minutes and you're just walking, you're not producing much heat, because I guess we haven't really talked about that. You're producing your own heat plus the heat that's coming in. Then you're obviously you don't need to drink that much. But if if you're going really fast, then you've got to drink more. And if you drink so much that you have to urinate 8 times during a 180K bike ride, you're drinking too much.
It is. I just remember it is for the first project I was involved in Eddie Cole's laboratory. We have to test the effect of just drinking water versus the carbohydrate. And drinking water in those conditions, you tended to urinate more. While when you drank carbohydrate during exercise, with carbohydrate and electrolyte, you didn't drink as much and actually didn't have to stop. So that was
well, that actually brings us back
something
to
that's important to consider, the type of drinks, because it impacts urine production during exercise.
So that brings us back to Alan McCubbin's we know he was saying what's the effect of osmolality. So I guess you're saying there that when you drink water, you're kind of diluting your number of particles per liter in the blood, so you're reducing your osmolality. But if you're drinking, with carbohydrate and electrolytes, you're not going to reduce the osmolality, so you won't have as much of a stimulus to produce urine.
Yeah, able to maintain
perfect
plasma volume better.
All right, and that also fits with another Twitter question. So Adam St. Pierre, he said, does sweat sodium concentrate? So, it relates to, we're talking about electrolytes, so sodium chloride, sodium, etc. Does sweat sodium concentration change over the course of a long duration exercise session to match the amount of sodium ingested? What do you think of that?
Okay, I can answer the first part of the question. There's a number of studies analyzing plasma electrolytes. They take samples during 2 hours of exercise with and without dehydration. And with dehydration, there's the sweating rate decreases, but also the concentration of sodium and chloride, other electrolyte, increases in comparison to the normal hydration state. So there's clear differences in the composition of electrolytes in the sweat. With it kind of goes in that's so there's greater, and that matches also what happened in the intravascular space, where or in the blood, in the plasma, there's greater sodium, there's greater chloride. So there's a match that in there. So you try to eliminate some of that.
Okay, sorry, can I just clarify? So you're saying, because people don't necessarily realize this, so when you're exercising and you're sweating and you're not drinking, you're actually, the sweat is less salty than the blood. So as you're sweating, your blood actually gets more and more salty, correct? And
yes,
if you're not drinking fluid, yes. So your sodium actually goes up. And then people start saying, okay, I'm going to drink drinks with sodium in them, etc. Now, are you just to clarify? Are you saying that as your blood sodium goes up during prolonged exercise, are you saying that the sweat sodium goes up as well?
Yes, exactly.
I didn't know that. That's cool. I didn't know that.
So the sweat become more concentrated. There's greater sodium losses in there.
Cool. All right, that's interesting. How are we going here? Is there anything? Now, you also said before we came on, you wanted to talk about, let me see if there's another Twitter question, and then you can answer this one while we're at it. You were saying it's good to think about the unknowns. What stuff do we still not know in this area? What do you think's important to look at? It's not
I think we have discussed some of those in regards, for example, the role of brain signaling in fatigue. This is still an area that we need to investigate, and particularly the interaction. You have signals from the periphery coming to the brain and what the brain does. That aspect is, there's very little information because they were limited by what we can measure. But in the area that I work the most in the cardiovascular system, I think there's a lot of to learn in that area in regards to the role and the periphery, the control of the circulation, what the role of the heart. There are some ideas that some people that think that the heart plays a major role in controlling pressure rather than in controlling flow. So this is something that it needs to be tested and investigated. The other thing is knowing about limitations. We apply Ohm's law that says a pressure gradient is equal to flow times resistance. And we calculate resistance, and then the changes on resistance, we use it to indicate what happened in the macrocirculation. And I think this is like a box there. It's just calculating. We need to have more direct measurements of what happened in the macrocirculation also during exercise to understand the control of the regulation of the cardiovascular system that we were mentioning, with the view that actually signal from the muscle itself might be more important than we have been thinking, at least from the integrated exercise physiology viewpoint. In other fields, they have thought about this. The other thing it is about the Fick principle as well. We use it and I use it, and you see the three-component equation. You have oxygen consumption, you have flow times arterial venous difference. It holds true based on mass conservation laws and thermodynamics, and it is good, but there's limits to how much information, how much insight we can gain in regards to mechanisms by using just the Fick principle. So what I am saying is that there's room for the new generation to come up with new models that obviously, as we have been discussing about multiple signals, models that integrate more of those signaling. And particularly, we are very influenced by the cardiocentric view of the heart. When we see the Fick principle, we think about cardio output, but actually we should talk about flow, just flow and the circulation, because in that way we can think about the contribution of the periphery, not only the heart.
Okay. So the Fick equation, VO2 max or VO2 equals blood flow times arterial venous oxygen difference. So we often think about VO2 max, for example. So VO2 max is maximum cardiac output times maximum arterial oxygen difference. You're saying, let's just not think about the heart. We've got to know what's happening in each muscle bed. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Basically, in the different territories, we have look at as the brain. We have even there's this concept where we apply Ohm's law to determine what happened to vascular tone in the so-called non-active muscles. As you can exercise in a bicycle, you have the hand and handlebar, and there's not much of a change in flow in the arms.
Yep.
But then when you calculate vascular conductance, because pressure is changing, then you say that there's vasoconstriction. Yes, but this is, they indicate vasoconstriction, but flow is maintained. So there's
so they're saying that the flow is saying...
using that marker just to indicate what happened in the microcirculation might have some limitation, because sometimes we are talking about something that we are not measuring, and we need to also measure conductance directly. And also there's many, in the phenomenon, for example, the cardiovascular strain that happens during prolonged exercise with dehydration, we have used the Fick equation. We have gone directly to measure cardiac output with the heart measurements. So it is a determination of cardiac output that is independent of other variables. So it's good to use different models that are not dependent on a calculation to demonstrate that phenomenon is actually
yes. Hey, has anyone done? Has anyone done? Because we've been doing so I collaborate with Eric Richter. I've had some sabbaticals there, and we use contrast enhanced ultrasound to look at muscle blood flow. So through the capillaries, the microvascular. Has anyone done that with, tried to do that with exercise in the heat and things like that? Or
not during exercise in the heat, but they have been done with other interventions. Like you have mentioned, but that's something that have to be done. There's challenges when the Copenhagen with Benza team and his colleague came up with the knee extensor. It's a beautiful model because you have your power, you get your average power, and then you have your metabolism. You can relay, and you have you can have an assumption of the muscle must engage, and so they have an important impact. The same thing with the model on the forearm. The forearm is a little more complicated because there's many veins that drains many different tissues, so it's more difficult to find the vein that drains just the muscle that you're studying. But while the leg, it is But when we go in the future, there's a lot of this unknown, is coupling work to metabolism. And that's have to be done real time, contraction by contraction. And that aspect, it needs methodological development and new ideas and new models. But definitely, I think it's where the field should move.
People should sign up to do some PhDs and things with you, yeah? Plenty of room for...
Well, it's just unfortunate. I think you told me about challenges in careers. I will ask a question. It is unfortunate at the moment. I don't have the funding to do that studies.
Oh. That's a common.
It's easier to have the ideas that they have the funding to.
Yeah, but that's a common. I don't want people to think, oh, I won't contact Jose because he hasn't got funding. I think a lot of people, myself, before I left academia, pretty much struggling to get funding. It's hard. So still contact you. Okay, so just another one from Twitter. Mark Preben Lindbeck, sounds a bit Danish himself. Does heat exposure post exercise promote extra mitochondrial adaptations? And if so, do these findings translate into performance outcomes? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that links to the question that you posed before in regards to the application of our fundings to elite athletes. My feeling, and this is based also in editorial that came in Journal Physiology, Carsten Lundby, last Niveau, that kind of challenge some of the results in this area of heat stress, that they were basically saying that if you use elite cyclists, you might find that the effects are much smaller or sometimes are not present. So elite cyclists, they already have a high density of mitochondria, high capillary density, and they train, and even in thermonuclear environment, they have core temperatures when they are training, they are high, above 39, even in thermonuclear environment. So adding a stimulus there to increase mitochondria density and function, I'm not entirely sure. There might be some marginal gains, but in research, because of the problem that we always have with methodologic variability and also biological variability, they are very difficult to be able to quantify them.
So I guess if you did a study where you went at the same absolute workload with and without, in cool versus heat, or thermoneutral versus heat, you could see that, yeah?
Yeah, well, I'm not, for me, in my mind, it's very clear for elite athletes, if you are training in a thermoneutral environment, you're going to compete like it was in Tokyo, the environmental conditions, 32, high humidity. It is important to acclimatize, because even if the effects are just a second or so, that means a lot when you are running a race that it is in like a middle distance, 3:28 in the 1500 or 29. That means quite a lot. So, but so in the practical terms, yes, we have to do this heat acclimatization. For experiment, for us to be able to quantify that effect, it becomes more difficult in highly trained people, because they generally, for any given level of stress, elite athletes, and you can say Eliud Kipchoge, and you have Andy Jones here, and he make the comment that he have an amazing ability to withstand this high intensity for those 2 hours. And that, so yeah, that's an indication that he and others are able to run at that pace. So this is an important point to consider, that in the elite, the effects that we characterize in the sub-elite populations might be smaller. In regards to the point of dehydration, I always remember Lance Armstrong being dehydrated and doing a time trial, and he did very poorly. So I don't say now here that dehydration doesn't affect even to the best ones. Also, of course, it will have an effect compared to himself being hydrated. He normally did quite well the time trial. He hydrated himself and so forth. But that day, he did one, and he didn't take care of his hydration level. He didn't perform as well.
So he would have come in hypohydrated, I guess you're saying, yeah? Or he didn't drink during it. He got dehydrated.
No, he had the previous stage. It was really, really long and hard. And then he had the time trial. So during the recovery period, he was not able to restore body fluids. That at least that's the comment that was made. What is absolutely clear is that he did worse that day.
Yes,
compared to his normal performance. So and they would say that he was dehydrated.
Yes, so to clarify, because I know this hypohydration, dehydration. So you're saying because he didn't restore his fluids, he started hypohydrated.
Yes, with the deficit, deficit in body fluid compared to his normal. And that's something that other groups and ourselves have shown that it's very reproducible. When you start hypohydrated, you see that affects the effect on physiological function. There's alterations in cardio output, heart rate, and temperature.
Yeah, actually,
that's very consistent.
Just thinking about that. So if you have a 4% reduction in your body weight, if it's hypohydrated, so if you're starting like that versus getting it during it, I'd imagine starting hypohydrated is probably worse because you've got that the whole way. When dehydrated, you're just getting it progressively. Yeah, is that no?
Yeah. That links nicely. There's another study that Glenn Montaigne did for his PhD, where he was drinking at different time point. Drinking always at any time point have an effect, but the later he drank is the greater the dehydration level. So it's to say, if you start hypohydrated, then you immediately, your responses are not the same. You immediately go to a higher core temperature, higher heart rate, stroke volume will be reduced. If you are measuring catecholamines or other responses, ventilation is also elevated compared to the control condition. So yes, hypohydration have also a significant effect.
So how about we start to finish up? This has been great. And if we just think about maybe, I don't know, three or four sort of takeaway messages from this chat. If you wanted to have, when you give a lecture, you think, oh, I hope they remember at least those three bits. What's the real takeaway that you want to get across?
Yeah, I think it is important that we think about complexity when trying to address the question of fatigue, what causes fatigue, or what causes alterations in cardiovascular function, alterations in respiratory function, metabolism. There's not a single factor. One have a paradigm. It's important to have a paradigm to be able to conceptualize that phenomenon and come up with ideas and new hypotheses for people to then test directly. But my main recommendation is to think about that level of complexity rather than trying to say it's just that factor. In regards to recommendations that we touch upon, just that people have to consider the event duration when thinking about hydration needs during exercise. Yes, we talk quite a lot about prolonged exercise, 2 hours and 2.5 hours or 3 hours. There's many events now that there are those durations, but that involves a very small percentage of the population. The majority of the people are active for half an hour, 40 minutes. And under those conditions, as you pointed out before, you are better off if you start well hydrated. You do your normal 30 minutes exercise or 40 minutes, and then when you get home, you drink a glass of water and you rehydrate yourself. There's not an important need to do it during exercise. Maybe if you want, particularly in the summer month when it is hot, then you can drink during in a shorter event because you feel better. There's no harm on it, but it's not absolutely necessary for short events. And the last point in regards, because that's the area that I think I'm most passionate about at the moment, is in thinking to resolve and to come up with new paradigms of how the cardiovascular system works. I think we have quite a lot of work to do in regards to understand the role of the periphery in how the blood moves around the circulation, and try to think about alternative to this cardiocentric dominated models that we use. We always think about the heart determining the periphery. In that regard, it's like some years ago when I came here to Brunel University, and you start thinking, oh, well, let's get some funding, and you think about pharmacological interventions that can increase flow, because that is of application for many different things. More recently, we have done work, at least recently in the last 15 years, is that with heating, you just heat the peripheral tissue and you increase flow there. So a concept sometimes of how the body is regulated, it helps you to come up with interventions that might be of help for recovery, for people that cannot exercise. So that's, I think, another take-home message is we are doing physiology and develop understanding because it can lead to new applications and new ways of solving or treating a very difficult problem that we had before, with new approaches. Great.
Well, actually, I wanted to give you a chance to say some of these bits and pieces you're excited about. So I know you've got, so when you're talking about if you heat an area, you increase blood flow. Is that related to, because I saw you've got temperature-dependent ATP release from human blood and endothelial cells. So is this part of what you're talking about there? Because like I said, I want you to get a chance to talk about some of your recent stuff.
Yeah. Well, at least we don't have the conclusive evidence that ATP is the major contributor to this hypothermia-induced hyperemia, and it's localized. It's local. If you just hit one part of the leg, you just increase flow in that part of the leg, not in the other. We have identified that if you hit red blood cells, then they release more ATP, but plasma or serum does not release ATP. Endothelial cells do not release ATP when we heat them up. So when we infuse ATP, then you get this vasodilation. If you have been involved in experiments at that time, that is very reproducible funding. And when you infuse it, when the arm is heated, then you have a higher hyperemia. So there's some evidence that indicates that might participate, that can be the mechanism by temperature itself induces this increase in flow. It is so it's an area that we want to, and we are investigating.
And that could have, I guess, clinical implications, maybe if someone's got, I don't know, peripheral arterial disease or something.
Yes,
Yeah.
Okay. It is. We want to do experiments during walking. I mean, elderly people. You have had people here talking about heat stress and heat therapy. This is an area that we also want to contribute to. We have had the model of knee extensor and superimpose heating in that condition, as you have been done. February did, and we did also before, and others have done before. So that's an area that
all right,
of interest.
Well, it's been fun to chat about this stuff. Some of this stuff is like bringing up all these memories from years ago. Some of the stuff I did, but you've obviously progressed that a lot. So thank you very much for coming on board, and I'll see you around.
Okay, thank you very much, Glenn, for having me. It
It's been
was a
fun.
pleasure. Thank
Okay.
you.
See you, mate.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. Please like, subscribe, pass it on to your friends and colleagues. Check out the other podcasts. Thanks again.